Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation, a first of its kind, but really unpacking the true state of African economies here on Kaya Biz. Good to have you all with us, and thank you so much for making time. I think as a introduction to the conversation and really understanding what it is we're trying to get out of it, is that we're speaking to an audience made up of Afropolitans, not only based in Johannesburg, but across the continent, who are eager to get a better understanding of the environments within which they live and work, eager to seek out opportunities with their peers across the continent, and of course looking to tap into some of those opportunities. So whilst we look to educate them and impart them with some kind of knowledge regarding the true state of the African economy, we also want them to get an understanding as to how they can actively participate in what has been dubbed inclusive economic growth across the continent. Let's start off maybe by getting each of your views on the current state of African economies for the moment as an icebreaker, and understanding some of the pros and some of the negatives that we currently see right now. Ade, let's start with you.
Okay, well, look, in my view, I think there's a lot of problems that still exist from the economic situation in Africa. Yes, we have had a lot of growth in the last decade, and we've also seen that with the declining commodity prices. Big economies like South Africa, Nigeria, Angola have really been struggling. I mean, South Africa, very low growth, below 1%. Nigeria, crippling recession. Angola is practically off the map in terms of economic growth. And that tells you that these countries, whilst they were enjoying the oil boom, they never really looked at other sectors of the economy to be able to diversify. Of course, Nigeria tried a little bit in terms of agriculture under the previous Minister of Agriculture, who is now the ADB President, Akinwumi Adesina. We were able to get some self-sufficiency in terms of rice production. But in Nigeria is at a crippling about 30%. Interest rate is sitting at about 30%. And then you have inflation sitting at about 17%. And also, given the fact that the government, I mean, I had the opportunity to interview President Obasanjo twice this past week.
Yeah, he was in South Africa.
He came to launch a book, Making Africa Work. And I asked him, how can we justify spending $1 billion or more on less than is the members of parliament? And he said, yes, he's called them names, called them thieves, armed robbers, and so on. But this, for the first time, they were able to now show their own budget. And he also complained about the fact that in Nigeria, we have 4 presidents in terms of the apparatus of state. So you have a speaker, you have a senate president, you have a vice president, and a president. They're all moving with about 50 cars in one transaction. So whilst there's opportunity in terms of technology and all of that is happening, social media, people are being able to access, there's a global village, as it were. There's a lot that needs to be done in the area of governance, in the area of corruption, and also in the area of pragmatism. So that's my take, that we need a lot more to be done, particularly from the government side, because the private sector is doing quite a lot, and the government needs to come to the party.
Ronak, your perspective?
So I want to dial back the clock a little bit. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we had this Africa rising narrative that came to light, and people were seduced by this 7% growth rate, the fact that Africa is the fastest growing continent. Lions on the move. You had all the sound bites, and people didn't really pay any attention to what was beneath that. And because of push factors and pull factors, there was no growth in the developed world, and Africa was growing, commodity prices were still buoyant. You had a situation where people were gravitating towards Africa. That kind of changed in 2014. We had Ebola, which really soured sentiment, and people were not discerning because they thought Africa was a country. Never mind the fact that in the US, you had a greater chance of contracting Ebola than in South Africa. And then we had the commodity price decline. We had Europe, which has had its structural growth problems, big trading partner for Africa. China started rebalancing its economy. We had a strong dollar. All of these hugely negative for the African continent. So we didn't have very good luck. We had bad luck via the external environment. But then our leadership and our policy making has also been quite poor in many instances. So we've scored a lot of own goals. If you look at Nigeria, for example, after the euphoria of President Buhari's win, change of power, democratic maturity in Nigeria, 6 months to get a cabinet. We had no direction on the fiscal policy. We waited, and the FX policy was handled in a very clumsy way, the MTN fine as well. In Zambia, you've had flip-flopping around mining legislation. South Africa, we had 3 finance ministers in a weekend, and now we've just changed the finance minister again. Doesn't do much to inspire policy confidence. So, the combination of bad luck and own goals is really where we find ourselves, and many of the continent's economies are struggling and are struggling for growth, but amidst this crisis and this geopolitical shakeup that we're seeing as well, I think there is opportunity because it's a wake-up call. We've always been susceptible to boom-bust scenarios. Yeah. We need to structure. Quite prepared for at the time. Exactly. There was an air of complacency. And what we really do need to do now is structurally transform. We know that we are not industrialized, but we keep singing the same story forever. We export tomatoes and we import ketchup, oil and refined oil. These chocolate, and we produce cocoa on the African continent and we import Swiss chocolate. It boggles the mind. And I think really, we need to take this opportunity to understand that what don't we have on the continent? We've got people, we've got resources, we've got land, we've got agriculture, we've got minerals. We just really need to get better at managing our own futures. Mm-hmm.
Strong points that were certainly raised there, and many of which I want us to come back to in just a moment to understand if political will is really quite there. But Martin, let's get your perspective on the current state of African economies. Clearly some realistic challenges which have been outlined by your colleagues on the panel, but what's your perspective?
Let me start with a provocative question. What if Paul Kagame was president of Nigeria? How would Nigeria look, and how would Nigeria be shaping up to how it currently is, or isn't? I think, we talk from an AU perspective, and we're always trying to have this generic perception of the continent. We hear about Africa 2063, which is in such distant future. It's this vague sort of concept of where, Africa should or could be in 40 odd years' time. For me, and both the points talk to this exactly, is what the continent has failed to do in the last 50 years and long before that, is to create an effective state. State institutions that can manage a aspirational, developing, emerging market political economy. Rather than having these grand wishful thinking visions of 4 or 5 decades time, we should rather be having, looking at who are the African effective states now. I would argue it's Ethiopia and Rwanda. Rather, what would happen if what would our continent look like increasingly if we had 5 Rwandas or 5 Ethiopias? States with self-engineered, good economic governance, creating effective states, and most importantly, resulting their actions, their policies, and implementation of those policies are resulting in a dramatic, rapid improvement in the quality of life of its citizens. I didn't say inhabitants, but citizens of those particular countries. We need to get a handful of countries, 5 or 6 countries, to create a sense of greater competition within the region, where peer-to-peer competition, if you will, where politicians start to understand the imperative for competition and self-improvement. Without self-improvement development, you will wither and you will ultimately die as a country. And that, I'm afraid, is the story of a majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 50, 60 years or so post-independence. The notion of self-inflicted wounds and own goals was mentioned. It's very much the case. Yes, the macro may be rather sort of disabling in the last 4 to 5 years, but I'm afraid that negative macro is being exacerbated most often by these own goals of leaderships across the continent.
Exactly. Strong issues that you mentioned, and I really want us to kick the conversation into 3rd and 4th gear now, because you mentioned quite a provocative question, as you said. What if Paul Kagame was the president of Nigeria? Now, many might come back and say that, well, Rwanda is a very small economy, very small population, doesn't have a lot of natural resources to work off of, and is also not highly industrialized. So coming off a low base where they've got a lot more flexibility to maneuver in cultivating a culture of competition where they're not constrained by older issues. So is it a matter of political will, or does it depend on the base at which political leaders who come into leadership need to start off from? Our systems in some countries are a little bit more complex for the leadership in order to find growth opportunities, Can
I say that complexity is an excuse for non-performance? And you're talking about Nigeria being maybe too big to manage. Well, what about China? China's close to 1.5 billion people. That's like 10 Nigerias. Yeah. So, I don't think it's about size. I think it's about creating an effective state, but ultimately effective states can't be created without a sense of nation and identity. And I think Paul Kagame fully understands that. Nigeria, I'm afraid, has really been unable to create a sense of national identity, a coherent identity, particularly north and south. And ultimately, how do you create an effective state without a nation? I think these are issues in South Africa which may, at a lesser level, are starting to grapple with as well.
I think just to respond to the Paul Kagame issue, I was saying to someone, I asked President Obasanjo, because we're talking about Nigeria's equity in the African Development Bank. We have about 9% of that. And I said, okay, now that we have a Nigerian who's the president of the ADB, would he be able to do what Donald Kaberuka did for Rwanda while he was president of the ADB for 10 years? And President Obasanjo said, well, he didn't really do much for Rwanda, he was doing it for Africa. Now, going back to the Kagame versus Nigeria in terms of whether he would have, Nigeria's had good leaders, although they don't last for long. For example, I know that Yar'Adua had a very good plan, where on account of his health, he couldn't stay in power for very long. And even President Obasanjo, for those 8 years, he was able to pay off our debt. Under him, we had reserves almost about $60 billion. He opened up the space.
Even though upon his exit, there were some questions regarding how much money was still left in the kitty.
But if you look at the consolidation of banks, Basel II, if you look at the fact that the auction for the GSM licenses was very open, and also he was somebody that was pro-Africa. So he was doing a lot with regards to NEPAD, with Thabo Mbeki and all of that. And they were able to launch NEPAD with Bouteflika. So when you look at Obasanjo's service to the nation, and he wanted to do a third term, but of course in Nigeria, the problem with Nigeria is that I say when you have too many powerful people and they're very selfish and ambitious. So people are not interested whether you can get the job done. Somebody else will say, but I also want to be president. And that is why with the emergence of President Buhari, sadly he's fallen sick. But if President Buhari could lead the country for about 20 years, like a Kagame situation, then we will be able to see Nigeria at least move in the right direction. But sadly, there are too many powerful people sitting with billions of dollars, and everybody wants to be president. That's the challenge for Nigeria.
We've seen elections take place, Ronak, and you've kept your eye on them. Does it have a positive influence on the economic direction of countries?
So I want to first touch on the debates of democracy versus development, because it's something that I think is particularly important in this current context. You compare countries like South Africa and Rwanda, right? So effectively both had reset in '94 with very, very difficult pasts. Rwanda's approach has been very different. So it's effectively commander-in-chief at the top, lack of kind of dissent, not a very open society, lack of civil society engagement. But if you think about the urgent challenges of the continent and Rwanda itself, you've got a situation where inclusive growth matters, right? So you look at what they've done with literacy rates, with infant mortality, with all the things in healthcare and education and soft infrastructure, and it works. You land in Rwanda, you get into your cab, you've got 4G in the car on the way to your hotel, that kind of thing. So it's an efficient development state. Whereas in South Africa, we pride ourselves on our constitution. We've got an open and free media. Our judiciary is independent. But the classic debate is, well, can you eat a free and fair civil society or press or open and independent judiciary? So politics of the stomach is what really matters. And there's an argument that says, and this is kind of derived from the Singapore model, the Lee thesis, which says that these things are luxury goods. Once you've achieved a certain level of development in terms of prosperity for the man on the street, is when you can start to have all these kind of things. And again, looking at history, you look at the Asian tigers, none of these countries industrialized under democracies. They were all kind of command and control economies. So the challenge for the African continent is we want to achieve democracy and we want to industrialize. And are they incompatible? That's the issue. And how we're going to achieve this is something that we can debate extensively. But I think what's important to note is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this. Different countries require different approaches. But the critical challenge for our generation and our leadership is the fact that we need to sort out our demographic dividend, because if we don't provide jobs, healthcare, education, and upward mobility, we are sitting on a ticking time bomb.
Does that also mean that we need younger presidents?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I've got to tell you a small little sort of anecdote here. I checked this. There are 5 heads of state in our African continent who have been in power since President Jimmy Carter was in power in the United States. So I think Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, George Bush Jr., Barack Obama, and now we know who's in charge now. And of those 7 presidents, imagine Jimmy Carter was still the president of the United States. How would the US look today? So I think it's coming to the crux of.
I think also what it is, if you look at countries where they're younger, I mean, I know that Cameron probably was elected prime minister at the age of about 42, Obama 47, Blair about 44, Trudeau, Canada. What you have is leaders who can, they can work very hard, and also people empathize with people who look like them. If the majority of the population is youthful, and you have a president that is youthful, there's more likelihood that people will feel empowered. But when you have a 90-year-old in office and he sleeps half of the time,
one of the
well, I can't
questions
relate to
gonna
Buhari
ask.
because he's been there before, and he's over 70.
So let's look at the facts. You've got this demographic disconnect where the average age between your population size and the people that lead is 43 years. I mean, your grandfathers are governing your grandchildren, and we don't even have grandmothers. That's the other thing, right? So, I mean, we've got very few African female heads of state. So the reality is that you create a ruling gerontocracy that is not responsive to the needs of your population. We know that our potential strength is the population demographics. We've got a young population that's going to play a big role in global consumption and production. But if they don't get jobs, if they don't get education, then it's a ticking time bomb, because that's when things like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram and militancy, all that kind of stuff starts to become appealing. So, I mean, in South Africa, you look at our opposition, you've got Mmusi Maimane and Julius Malema, both under 40. And arguably there's that shift kind of happening within the opposition ranks, but not in governance or in the ruling governments at the moment. But the reality is, I think we do need to see that gap narrowing, because kind of the leaders that we have were from the pre-colonial era. We had liberation, but they're from a military background. They like this button-up kind of culture, secrecy, whereas millennials are open. And they want to be more engaged. You've got social media and the likes.
I want to challenge you on that one. Is the political will there, though, to adopt a culture of youthful leaders who lead millennials, taking advantage of the demographic dividend in order to see a cultivation of growth in African economies? I know from a Nigerian perspective, you told me, Ade, that Macron would not have won and become president because he's too young.
To contest for president of Nigeria, you must belong to a political party. You must be 40 years of age. You must be an unadjudged bankrupt. And there's also one other criteria. So Macron doesn't
even qualify.
Criteria. But also what it is again is that I quoted Kofi Annan to President Obasanjo. Kofi Annan said in Melrose Arch in 2010, Africans are very wary of criticizing their leaders, and African leaders are wary of criticizing their neighbors. And we all know what President Mbeki said, what crisis is Zimbabwe. So the challenge for us as young Africans also is to put ourselves out there.
Yeah.
Because if we're waiting for the old guard to shift, they're not likely to do it on their own.
But if we point to the example that we saw in the Gambia most recently, where the president lost the election, democratic election, and we saw West African leaders stand up and actually say that we will invade if you don't actually step down. Isn't that a positive example that maybe we are shifting in the right direction?
But they should have asked him to step down 10 years ago. He spent 20 years there. So that's a challenge for Africa. We don't want leaders who would spend more than 10 years max in office, whether they're performing or not.
Even if they are Paul Kagame.
Well, we don't also want a leader that stays there forever, because that's not also good for democracy.
So, I mean, the term limits are meant to they're not meant to play to your strengths. They're meant to protect against a bad leader's weaknesses. And I want to look at the example of Cote d'Ivoire under Houphouët-Boigny. It was the jewel of West Africa. And it was a diversified economy, really prosperous. Once he died, there was a power vacuum, infighting, and the country effectively lost 2 decades. And that shows you when succession is not managed appropriately, you end up with this kind of situation. And that's the argument for constitutional term limits and the likes, because if it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong.
Well, I think we want to conclude on that note when it comes to political will, as well as the dynamics that we do see on the continent. But I do want to pick up on another trend that's obviously come through the conversation, and that's the heavyweights. You mentioned the Nigerias, the South Africas. Kenya hasn't come up, but Rwanda has. And there's always this interesting dynamic with regard to the juggernauts of the African continent who've really been solid leaders versus smaller, highly performing, highly competitive economies who are actually gaining strength. When it comes to regional integration and intra-African trade, are we we seeing that these smaller countries actually are developing a stronger voice to really influence leaders of more industrialized economies? Maybe let's start with you there, Martin, to get perspective regarding Rwanda and how that's really helped aid the development with participants like Kenya within the East African community of countries.
I certainly hope so. As you rightfully say, the sub-Saharan African economy has always been sort of a tripod in three countries: South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. In recent times, it had the rise of Angola, which has now fallen by the wayside. It's called, oil-propelled economy, hand-to-mouth economy, and in deep need for, how shall I say, political and structural reform. Kenya's firing in terms of quantitative growth, but debates around the qualitative nature of that growth. Nigeria, in real term, sort of recession and reverse gear. The rise of the likes of Rwanda as an effective state. A truly developmental state, not just lip service toward that end. Ethiopia this last quarter surpassed Kenya into the GDP size, which is very interesting. So Kenya, I'm afraid, relatively speaking, is in reverse gear as a regional hegemon. Ethiopia is overtaken, and Tanzania is becoming a little bit more finely getting its growth act together, away from its sort of introspective socialist past to more, to an extent, embracing more of a sort of, to an extent, more market-based sort of approach to development. As I said earlier, we need to have, and you allude to it, if capital has been obsessed and remains largely obsessed with demographics, unfortunately. Hence the attractiveness in recent years of Nigeria, of Kenya, and South Africa. But what about the small countries of Africa? What about the Burundis, the Malawis, the Namibias, the Botswanas, the Swaziland, the Sothos, the Gambias, very Benin, very small countries. Arguably, the continent has just too many countries, but there's no solution to that. Unlike Asia, where the small, you mentioned earlier, the tiger economies of Asia, and even in China's case, China is just a collection of incredibly competitive cities and provinces, all of whom fall under the China sort of political umbrella, but effectively are brutally competitive internally. What we need to see in our continent is that sense of competition emerging, but small states in Africa have been unable to define for themselves a comparative economic advantage, Asia style, and ultimately translating comparative into a competitive economic position. That's the story of the South Koreas, the Taiwans, the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, subsequently Malaysias, etc. The one thing I have to counter and disagree very strongly on is the starting point, and the keyword diversification came up earlier, which is an absolute imperative to long-term embedded development. But there's an assumption, particularly by leaderships and commentators on our continent, that somehow we have resources in the ground, commodities. Therefore, there's almost a natural sort of assumption that resources result in some sort of competitiveness on the manufacturing front. It doesn't. The examples from recent economic history of all developing and emerging markets, the most successful countries in developmental terms, the last century or so, have been those within resource-poor economies, and I just named them. The only resource that counts is what is the potential in what is in your own population or talent you can attract into your own country.
That's a mindset shift.
It has nothing to do with resources. South Korea, the greatest industrial success story of the last 30, 40 years, zero resources. Taiwan, similarly so. China, similarly so. The only resource China has is gold and coal. That's pretty much it. Singapore, zero resource, not even water. So this assumption is somehow you have something in the ground and you should somehow sort of, that should translate into competitiveness. Totally false.
So I want to come in there because, our strength is our population dynamic, but we are so far behind the rest of the world that we need to use every resource at our disposal. And that's the reality. We're not going to catch up. We need to grow exponentially. So if we don't use our resources, there's no chance. So while I agree that, we need to prioritize structural reform, transformation, and leverage other aspects to make ourselves more competitive, we've got advantages, let's use them. The other point I want to make is around the AU. So the reality is that these smaller economies, they may be competitive, but they don't give investors the scale, and capital matters. So unless we have these regional dynamos that are growing, Africa is not going to move anywhere. Now, in the current context of this geopolitical shakeup, Trump cutting aid, China rebalancing, we need to realize that as the African Union, our power is as a collective. But now if our big three economies, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, are all preoccupied with domestic issues, are all experiencing negative to muted growth, we need to understand that our powers as a collective, a population in excess of 1 billion, with all the demographic trends, with all the competitive advantages, that's when you start to flex your muscle on a global stage.
Are we taking full advantage of that?
No, because regional integration is abysmal. It's at 12% or something.
14, 17, depending on
Yeah.
which stats you read.
Exactly. So if you're not going to get any favors from the external environment, focus on the ease of doing business and the cost of doing business so that you can trade with each other. Expand your market size. Create more compelling markets in that regard. And then economic diplomacy, right? So Kenya's been very good at this, kind of shopping around for the best deal from everywhere. So the US is interested in Kenya, China's interested in Kenya, India's interested in Kenya. And under Amina Mohammed, their foreign secretary, they were able to leverage this particularly well. So rather than focusing on ideologies and isms and ologies and all these kind of wonderful things, it's being pragmatic. And that's something that we don't do very well on the continent.
Who's getting it right? ECOWAS versus SADC versus EAC?
I think on the economic front, I think the EAC definitely. Politically, ECOWAS is starting to kind of speak as a collective around some of the more meaningful issues on the continent. You mentioned the Gambia, but still a long way to go.
I think the challenge for Africa is simple. There will be no economy without people. I remember when Boko Haram stole the girls about 3 years ago. And people were talking about Nigeria. In fact, the girls were stolen a week after Nigeria was declared Africa's largest economy. And we all know what happened after that. And President Jonathan lost the election. The biggest challenge for Africans is that we must hold our leaders to account. I challenge any of us here to tell me who their member of parliament is and when was the last time they spoke to them. And you see, when these guys are sitting in parliament and they're sitting there and earning so much money and nobody's communicating with them about leadership, and that's what you see in Europe, where people write letters to the Queen and they want to get a feedback from the Queen because she's still the head of the government. So what I find is, for example, Ghana. I think Ghana is a beacon of hope because since 1992, they've managed to always transfer power, even to opposition. The first time we had that in Nigeria, we were celebrating as if we won the Olympics. So Ghana is a beacon of hope. The sad thing about Ghana is that they're very insular, because I lived in Ghana for a year. So everything you want to do, they say, oh, you're not a Ghanaian. Look, I'm wearing a Ghanaian.
I see that.
Yes.
So you're declaring that you're Ghanaian from today?
I'm full Ghanaian because I love the country. In fact, if I were to be given a chance, I'll move to Ghana again. But the thing is also with ECOWAS. I said, how do you do business with your neighbors when you can't even communicate with them? So Nigeria's got Niger, Chad, Republic of Benin, and Cameroon as its neighbors. They're all controlled by France. So we can't get, in fact, when President Jonathan wanted to talk about Boko Haram, they had to go and meet Francois Hollande in Paris. So that tells you that all this regional integration is just hot air. But what needs to happen is there's got to be more political will. The citizenry must be very proactive in holding their leaders to account. Sitting in Santin and having a 3-course meal while people are sitting in Pretoria is not going to help us.
Accountability and holding them holding them to account and ensuring that there's ongoing conversations regarding regional integration. I also want to throw in there the Kenya Vision 2030, South Africa National Development Plan, and even if we align it with the AU's 2063, all these national plans, do they actually speak to regional integration? Because as you said, issues are quite insular when it comes to economic growth, job creation, and a stable environment to ensure that there's ongoing FDI. Does the problem also stem from that we're working along these guidelines, which you alluded to earlier, looking at decades of development from now, but we're also not taking into account working alongside our neighbors to ensure that there's a common vision and a common goal at the end. Ronak?
First question, sorry, I just wanted to put this in.
Go ahead.
The AU is funded by the Europeans. That's the first problem we have. And President Obasanjo alluded to the fact that President Mbeki is looking at alternative sources of funding. The AU headquarters was built by the Chinese. So even if you can't manage your own affairs, how are you going to then guide the countries under your umbrella to manage their own affairs?
So you're saying that's a problem?
I said, if you cannot fund your own organization, how do you then direct people under your
Don't
umbrella?
we all get by with a little help from our friends, Ade,
Well,
in order
not
to
when
ensure
it's
that there's development?
95% funded by outsiders. And who then control, who wags the dog? So it's very important that the AU, but also this automatic membership, we've seen with Brexit. The UK, for example, never joined the euro because they thought it was an issue of sovereignty. And when they were shadowing the Dutch mark, they couldn't keep up because the UK doesn't manufacture like Germany. But also, if you look at the AU's automatic membership, so even if you're a tyrant like al-Bashir, you're part of the collective, they all give themselves a pat on the back. Look at South Sudan, it's falling apart because of a power struggle. So when I look at the AU, I look at it as a basket case. It doesn't mean anything. The only thing it's there for is the symbolism that, oh, as Africans, we must speak with one voice. But in reality, if you want to travel from here to Nigeria, you have to get a visa. If you want to go to Ghana, you have to get a visa. So what's the value of the AU? It means nothing. It's just a hollow ritual.
Hollow ritual. Do you agree? Quickly, I just want to get responses from the panel on that.
A general question to you and whoever's listening. Can you name me 3 ways in which the AU has impacted your life? You can't name me one.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, look at Asia. Asia's succeeded by and large in development terms, not because of a regional pan-Asian plan. It's a country level, or even a city level, a provincial level, not at a regional level.
So country level's fine.
Country, ultimately the success of a country will depend upon its the design and implementation of its own policies, not that of an outside entity.
Makes sense. Ronak?
So, look, I mean, the AU leaves a lot to be desired with regards to development plans, largely aspirational, good to have a vision, but let's go back to basics. Let's start from the ground up. Basic things. If you want to be an entrepreneur in this country, the cost of Wi-Fi, the cost of telecoms, taking 3 taxis to get to wherever you need to get, it's prohibitive. And we need to create an enabling environment which is going to facilitate greater entrepreneurship, where people who can ultimately give it their best shot are enabled to, because we need that kind of innovation in our economies. So I think we get fixated again on these grand aspirational plans. What are we doing on a micro level? And I'm a macro guy, but still, we need to focus on the bottom up issues, because ultimately inclusive growth is about it's not about ideologies. It's about giving people a shot at upward mobility, because ultimately unequal societies are unsustainable. And the sooner politicians, businesses also realize this, I think the more we move towards a solution. In South Africa, we were living in this, or for a long time, we had a situation where there's labor, business and government all operating in a silo, complete distrust. Partially last year, with the CEO initiative, we saw a thawing in that relationship and some progress, but that distrust is back now. So I think ultimately we need to pull in the same direction. And like I said, our challenges, we're so far behind that we need exponential growth, and we can only do that by pulling together.
If I may just add to that, what keeps me awake at night right now, particularly in South Africa, is you talk about lack of, we don't need the isms, and you're totally correct, is that we have this imperative for inclusive growth, particularly considering the inequalities we have in this society amongst many others, and particularly considering the demographic wave coming through. But the automatic reaction of the state and many observers is that inclusive growth requires a more aggressive public policy. I strongly disagree with that. That merely will compound the problem, I would argue. Inclusive growth for me is a productivity issue. And I'm talking about this increasingly these days because there's people who are locked into jobs, those who are fortunate to have a job, in low productivity jobs, and unable to move up a productivity sort of curve to increase more income. The challenge in South Africa is the narrative often is almost like Thomas Piketty's sort of thesis of capital, or even dare I say Karl Marx's, where you have it's capital versus labor, and there's this inherent tension between the two, and it's very zero-sum. I think the challenge in South Africa is that the majority of poor people, through no fault of their own, it's not so much they're excluded from productivity. They're not just working for capital, they just ain't working at all. And that reinforces the inequality. That is the ultimate cause of the inequality. So I think the ultimate solution for me, inclusive growth really, is how do you provide 2 things. Firstly, public goods, public services, as you allude to.
Health, education.
Correct, which puts poor people or people in low productive positions into public service networks, be it public networks of training, of education, of financial services, or whatever it may be, to improve their lot in life and gain productivity as a result, raise their own productivity levels through those provision of public services. And secondly, into networks of a marketplace. How do you plug people in low productive or non-productive jobs into the networks of a marketplace? And I don't believe that comes from a more interventionist state, a more aggressive public policy, Piketty style. It comes from a more, as you allude to, a more enabling environment.
And I think
from an effective state.
the role of business is important here, because businesses are starting to wake up to the realization that, you know, we've been fixated on the quantity of growth. We need to focus on the quality of growth. So what are we doing to invest in education, in healthcare? Because ultimately our workforce, their health and happiness is linked to our prosperity. So, you know, that kind of reorientation of the capitalist model into caring capitalism, or what Tony Elumelu calls Afri-capitalism, to say that actually you can do well and you can do good simultaneously, is something that I think belatedly a lot of businesses are waking up to.
I think also, just to add to that, I've been in South Africa for 15 years, and I remember Thabo Mbeki talking about the two economies. I see every day, how people try and come into Sandton from the township, and getting back is almost a nightmare. People get robbed in town, either their phones, it's mostly young ladies. And I wonder what change will bring if we're able to export some companies, maybe like what they have in the rest of Africa, export processing zones, where you say, okay, for you to be able to have 50,000 staff, you must have maybe 20% of the staff in the township, so you create jobs in the township. Also, I think one of the biggest challenges in South Africa that I've seen, and it always comes up in the form of xenophobia, is that when you have so many people from the rest of Africa who are well skilled, sometimes more skilled than a lot of South Africans, and they're not able to participate in the economy, either because they didn't arrive here before 92, so they're not PDI, they're not HDI, or maybe they don't have an ID, because when I go to South Africa, even though I had a British passport and I was very qualified, what I used to find was every time they asked me, where's your ID? I said, what's an ID? Oh, the green book, okay. So I had to pursue the ID as if my life depended on it. Now that I've got the ID, I don't even know what I'm going to do with it, because I'm not black enough. So I think the critical thing for South Africa is to look at the full democratic graphics, because they say in South Africa that South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. The reason why America is such a great country is that Hispanics, black people, white people, every extraction, they come to America and they hit the American dream. And so the South African dream should not be exclusive to South Africans. Otherwise, the economy would not grow exponentially.
I want us to touch on that, but I also want to build up on the point that Ronak made regarding capital with a conscience, as well as government not necessarily pulling all the levers when it comes to cultivating this competitive environment. How do we get it right and strike a balance between the participation regarding the private sector and public sector? Because as we know, capital needs confidence, they need assurance, and they don't want to invest in laborers and a workforce in the future that actually might not work to their benefit in the long term, and reduce the investment return that they take back to their shareholders. Are we finding that the confidence dynamics, the operating system and policies structured by government, and the prospects that capital is looking for are actually speaking to each other? Because there's still quite a strong level of distrust between these parties. Ronak?
No easy solution, right? Yeah. Very, very complex. So the one thing is a mind shift. Big business needs to realize that they need to play a role in societal development. Now, whether that's, in the past we've had things like mining in South Africa, which has largely been exploitative. We've had, you look at the oil fields in Nigeria, a company like Shell, which has largely been exploitative, where it's, take what you can get. We give no, we don't really care at all about the community and the impact thereof, environmentally, in terms of people, otherwise. And that needs to change. So it's a case of saying, well, we may take lower profits or have lower shareholder returns today, but ultimately it's better for our model in the long run. So, and investing in the community development. So that needs to happen. But at the same time, you need.
But in Africa, it's been the carrot and the stick dynamic, right? There's been more of the stick than it is the carrot, and we kind of need to strike a balance between the two.
Yeah.
And it's taking a while for us to get there. Are there potential models and lessons that we can learn from and in implementing these correctly?
Again, no one-size-fits-all approach, but what I do know is that, politics of the stomach, getting people clothes, houses, educations is what matters. So how we get there, we're not going to do it exclusively through the private sector or exclusively through government.
I was even going to say the Scandinavian model is the best model. If we, as Africans, that we have so many poor people, out of the 1 billion that is being bandied around, maybe about 70% of those live on less than $1 a day. So if you look at Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, it's even better than, because there's welfare in Europe as well. But Scandinavia, they've managed to get it right. Yes, high taxation, but you see that there's less poverty and there's less insecurity in those countries. You rarely hear about terrorism
but some might argue that the
Scandinavia.
education system is quite efficient. There's job creation opportunities also that are cultivated there. So
You look, it's still a better module than what we have currently. So, somewhere between the UK model and the Scandinavian model would be useful. It's better than what we have now, where things are just falling apart.
Well, I mean, a case in point is the infrastructure sector, right? The infrastructure finance model, as we know it, is not working. It's completely dysfunctional because you've got long time horizons in terms of these projects, but private sector companies are reluctant to commit given how uncertain political dynamics and policy dynamics are. They've got no surety around that kind of stuff. Country situations change dramatically, and similarly, governments are cash strapped in the current environment. So how do we bridge that gap? So you've got multinationals, you've got governments, you've got development banks, and you've got kind of all these actors, but you've got trust issues, and how do you resolve that is something that I think holistically we need to figure out.
I can't leave you out of the conversation. I saw you shaking your head when we mentioned the Scandinavian model just a moment ago.
Yeah, no,
and of course the distrust between these
I'm
stakeholders.
totally from the sort of Asian approach here. Low taxation, brutal capitalism, and allow people to compete. I think it's far more easy to create sort of the Scandinavian model when you have a relatively homogeneous population, small populations, and a very sizable sovereign wealth fund to finance it. I think in just an extreme example, if I may, and what I see a major problem is, we talk about responsibility of business, and that's obviously a given. But we have a capitalist overlay here, which is often very deeply a socialist system, and that applies to many countries across the region, I would argue, where Eastern Europe got over the sort of socialist model back circa 1989 thereafter. Our continent really hasn't. And I allude to particularly to state-owned enterprises. I think the biggest break on development and growth, arguably, in many of our countries, ours included, is the mismanagement and obsolete ideological sort of views of management of state-owned enterprises. I'll give you an extreme example. The most successful cities or countries, if you will, for me in recent times have been Singapore and Dubai. And both these, I don't believe in government ownership. I don't think government should own anything, but it's two exceptions: Emirates Airlines and Singapore Airlines. And they're so imperative that these SOEs in those two cases are of such extreme national strategic importance that if Emirates as an airline fails, Dubai fails. The whole country fails. The whole Emirate fails. Singapore Airline fails, the whole country fails. How are we managing our SOEs? If our SOEs fail, which they are, and no one can deny that, what implications does that have for South Africa? And I don't think we've had exactly 10 years now, since 2007, bringing it close to home, since 2017, of this very failed policy called developmental state, which has become a euphemism for state control, state monopolistic practices, and rampant corruption. If we don't solve that, there ain't any effective state being created. There's no inclusive growth whatsoever, and I'm afraid we're in reverse gear. Now I see that example across many other countries, across the continent, where the state continues to own key assets, predominantly around infrastructure and utilities and the like, and very much crowds out private capital investing in these sectors and creating opportunity for citizens and people in business.
I want you to give us maybe 3 solutions as to how we can fix that very briefly, because Zambia also came to mind, where they nationalized their mines. They should have learned the mistakes.
And Mozambique.
Precisely.
And Tanzania.
So if you could fast forward, 15, 20 years back and actually change the dynamics, would it be skills from the private sector? Would it be ensuring that you have the right education base? And of course, markets to ensure that not only are your economies diversified, again, thinking of the Zambian example where it's mainly copper mining driving the economic performance of that country. Are those some of the elements that you would have picked up on?
Of course, we relatively new concepts like, shared value, Michael Porter style, and responsibility of business. We all get that, and that's imperative. But really, there seems to be this, and it's almost, I don't understand it. I don't see this even in China, which is managed and overseen by the Chinese Communist Party. But the rhetoric one hears, and I think capitalism, embrace capitalism, embrace private capital, and watch developmental magic happen. That's the Asia story of the last 30, 40 decades. And I'm afraid here we still have very much of a sort of socialist mindset of how we view growth. And I'm afraid that ain't working.
So I think also what the role of government, I mean, maybe these politicians, they need to go and read what government should be doing. Government is supposed to be running the country, providing leadership, managing international, agreements and, getting the country up to speed. Or maybe looking at things like education that can broadly bring the population to a higher level. Government, politicians don't have enough knowledge about how to run businesses. It's simply not their forte. But what
and it shouldn't be, like you said
what
earlier.
I see, for example, the banks in Nigeria is a very good example. When they liberalized the banks, you saw Nigerians, very dynamic people, very commercial, and they started to run those banks up to the level of a Zenith or a GT Bank. I mean, those banks can stand with any South African bank in terms of their profile. And they managed to get into Rwanda, they're in Zambia, they're in Ghana. In fact, Nigerian banks have taken over the entire Ghanaian landscape because the Ghanaians were relaxed, they're enjoying their fufu. And the Nigerians came in.
Since you're honorary Ghanaian, I think you were enjoying your fufu too?
Absolutely. But I like Banku more than fufu. Fufu sends me to sleep. So that's the critical thing. Government must do what they are elected to do, which is to run the country, make sure that everything is working like we see in Europe, and let the businessmen get on with it. But they must give them all the support that they need.
You mentioned a critical point, and this ties into some of the themes that were touched on earlier: inclusive growth, entrepreneurial spirit, and of course letting government govern and business people actually run with the business and economics of the day. With the Afropolitan audience that we have, we're talking to people who run corporates, who are entrepreneurs themselves, and look to develop a dynamic of access to the market. And we did touch on the intra-Africa trade stats earlier, which we know are quite low, but from an entrepreneurial spirit perspective. And maybe you touched on it briefly earlier when it comes to the South African dynamics versus non-South African residents. Are there countries and economies which are getting it right, cultivating the entrepreneurial spirit from a skills enablement perspective, operating environment, and even mindset, where people look for opportunities in the market to become real industrialists in the future? And I think top of mind, one looks at these example of Somalians who come to South Africa and have literally taken over this spaza shop space. So it seems as though there's a mindset thing there, and working within an environment which allows you to cultivate the spirit. Entrepreneurship, are we getting it right on the African continent? Ade?
Look, I think there's no need to even look far. I mean, if we look at most Africans, they do things for themselves. If you look at, there's a 14-year-old girl that I have just discovered. She's a Nigerian American, and her mother is from Mauritius, Zuriel Odunwale. She's interviewed about 24 presidents, and she's a filmmaker. She's only 14. You can imagine when she gets to 20, what she would have done. And if you look at if all around Africa, the stories of people who have been able to come up. There's a Ghanaian chap.
Can I challenge you on that one? Sure. Politics of the stomach was something that Ronak mentioned.
Yeah.
She grew up in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, Zuriel.
Which is an African child.
African child. Yeah. But she didn't have to face issues that deal with politics of the stomach
in
order to think as an entrepreneur, right?
Let's look at the Ghanaian landscape. There's a gentleman that came up, Tony Elumelu, under the Tony Elumelu Entrepreneurship Program. There's a gentleman that made a bicycle out of wood. A bicycle, everything is wood. And it's being sold all over. If you watch even on CNN every week, you get an Inside Africa slot, and you see how much entrepreneurship that Africans have. What they don't get is access to finance and to get the support from the banks, because the banks are thinking, look, 30% interest rate, I can't give you the loan at less than 30%. And who's going to be able to finance a loan at 30%? So Africans are entrepreneurial. It's the government that doesn't get it. African governments are insensitive. Many of our leaders they can't be held accountable. And when you can't hold people to account, it's very difficult for change to happen.
You agree, Ronak?
Yeah, look,
we're trying to solve the world's problems here in an hour.
Yeah.
So not very easy solutions that can be found. But again, unpacking the situation and the status quo, is government prioritizing entrepreneurship?
So look, I come
entrepreneurship?
from a society of refugees. My family is originally from what's now Pakistan. When India and Pakistan split, the border, my family fled. I've got family all over the world, and I come from a society of refugees, which means society of entrepreneurs, and necessity means that you're forced to innovate, to adapt to wherever you are. So my mom's side of the family is from Mauritius. My dad's side of the family ended up here. and I'm the first person in my family to be a professional. So that there's innate desperation and adaptability that forces entrepreneurship, and I think in a lot of these countries, Somalia is a prime example, where you make a livelihood out of entrepreneurship because you don't have a social safety net, you don't have education, you don't have skills, and the likes. So I mean, necessity and innovation. You look at most countries across the continent. People hustle in Nigeria because you sit in a traffic jam and you'll see some of the most innovative things in that space, because
give us an example for someone who hasn't been to Lagos, like myself.
They say that you have better ideas in Nigerian traffic jams than in the Harvard Business Review.
Wow.
That's kind of
that's a challenge.
While you're in the car, they sell you a house, they sell you a boat, they sell you a chicken.
Yeah, I mean, in your car, you've now got contraptions where you can sit in the back seat and work on your laptop, these kind of things, but just innovation out of desperation, almost. Now, in terms of the banking sector and the likes, the reality is that interest rates in many countries are prohibitive. How are you meant to pay off a loan at 30% interest rates, 25% interest rate in countries like Zambia and Ghana? This is why you have cashless or cash-based economies. Now, as we try shift to a more inclusive banking system, bank more of the population, we need to be more responsive to what societal challenges are. It's crazy to be spending 25% on a home loan, for example. That's why you do things in cash. So again, we need to look at existing paradigms in many instances and say that this is not working. We're so far behind. How do we have this moonshot thinking? And you look at kind of the African Leadership University, what Fred Swaneker is doing there. They're saying, well, if we adopt traditional and conventional models, we're never going to catch up. We need stuff that's going to leapfrog. And that's why they're looking at a more kind of practical, entrepreneurial kind of university, which will create entrepreneurs who will in turn go out and create jobs for the continent.
I need to get your points coming in here, Martin, too, giving us a sense of entrepreneurship. Is it the answer to achieving inclusive economic growth on the continent?
It has to be. There was a report by the IMF came out a week or so ago, which painted a pretty dismal state of things. The workforce increase is 2.6% per year the last decade in Africa. In Asia, it was 1.2%, Far East Asia, and India's 1.6%. So I'm afraid, and this is don't shoot the messenger here, but there ain't no jobs available. So the only option one has is entrepreneurship. Now let's not confuse survivalist economic activity, i.e. hustling whatever it may be on the streets of Lagos, to true entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is about creating an asset, scaling it, and ultimately providing a service, a value, and perhaps even a sale down the line. But I think coming back to country, state leadership, we need to hail the heroes, and the heroes are the entrepreneurs. Young African people must see that the route to wealth and success is not through public sector or working for a state-owned enterprise and making money in ways where money should never be made. But the route to success should be through entrepreneurship, and I think it comes down to the tone of leadership. How does the leadership sort of hail the heroes, the entrepreneurial success stories? And there's so many out there. We need to talk more about them. We need to see our politicians talking about them, rather than just talking mindless politics continuously with a fiery rhetoric we too often hear. Let's talk about those entrepreneurial success cases by young Africans who really, really want to change the continent. I just wish the politicians was patriotic at times. I want to change the continent in such a constructive manner as what many young Africans do.
So what's interesting there is that we tend to hail people as being successful. You're a successful professional, you're a successful lawyer, successful banker. What we need on the continent is significant leaders. People who are actually going to have an impact on society, rather than simply chasing monetary wealth. People who are actually going to create prosperity, create jobs, create impact. Because if you are a successful banker working for Goldman Sachs, part of the diaspora, and you buy your apartment in Manhattan, next thing you know you're buying a Porsche or whatever, if you're not the type of person with the skills who's going to come back and shape the continent and start something, who is?
Precisely. Powerful note to add on. You want to add
and I
there,
think
Ade?
also, I mean, if you look at the UK model, I think Africa, we're too obsessed. I saw a week or two ago an MBA program, a European MBA program, being advertised, and so many African women were there. They were so excited. I told them I can teach you everything you're going to learn in an MBA in 10 minutes at the bar. Yes, at the bar. And it's simple. Stop consuming, rather be a producer. So we went through everything that they were wearing, and they found out they didn't produce a single item that they were wearing. And it's up to about 10,000 rand. But also, I think if you look at the UK, people like plumbers, electricians, they make a lot of money because everybody wants to work for Morgan Stanley or Barclays. And these plumbers, they don't even go to school, but they can fix because you must have a plumbing problem or an electrical problem or a carpentry problem. So we need to invest in vocational skills. We need to also make sure that, for example, in the Nigerian community where I come from, I have sworn that if I go to any meeting and there's no women at that meeting, I have to leave because I don't see any logic of saying that you are developing and you're only developing the men and the women are sitting in the side.
How many meetings have you had to leave since making that decision?
Well, I've left one in protest, but you know, I will leave more because they always come without their wives or their daughters. They just come and they're all looking scary because these guys are big and they're all like 12. So seriously, so I said to them,
as long as the women are also playing a critical role though and are not just there to take notes, right?
The young people must be part of it also. People must get out of their comfort zone. If you're watching a movie for 6 hours every weekend, I have a problem with that, unless you're in the movie.
I get you. Or helping to produce the elements in the background that goes into that movie. I do want us to start with our concluding comments, and you have all touched on so many dynamics, but we speak into an Afropolitan audience who want access and exposure to the rest of the continent. Where do you start? Where do you position yourself? And how do you take advantage of the elements, macroeconomic elements, some of which we cannot control, but how best do you take advantage of the situation now in 2017 to be a game changer, to be a producer and to be a capitalist with a conscience to aid in the development of the continent? Ade?
It's very simple. Look, I always say to people, every country you get to, try and open a bank account and try and get a driver's license. People might think it's very basic, but if you want to do business in a country, you should be able to move around, maybe rent a car. I found out that I could do that in Zambia. I was actually quite shocked that I could rent an Avis car, and they delivered it to the house where I was staying in Kabulong. So you need a bank account, you need to register a company. In Nigeria, it might take you longer. There's a new executive order from the vice president or the coordinating vice president or acting president. We have a lot of titles for the presidents now in Nigeria. So you've got to register a company, I think is useful, and you've got to also find a local partner in that country. I mean, you could choose to do business in any African country. In fact, what I found when I was in Togo about 20 years ago was that because Togo is a French country, a lot of people who go into Togo, they're mostly people from French countries and France. So going there from England was a different picture entirely. And because I was coming from England, the stuff that I brought in, they didn't bring it in from France. So also you have to avoid the bigger countries because sometimes competition is more brutal and you need large capital outlay like in Nigeria. So if you go to a smaller country, maybe the Gambia or Ghana or even Senegal, for example, wine duties in Senegal is 17%. In Zambia is about 140% to take wines in, although the Zambians drink more than the Senegalese. So you got to do your maths and weigh all these options. But also it's easier to go to countries that are around you because from a cost perspective, if you want to go to Botswana, it's maybe 2-3 hours by road. If you want to go to Congo, it will take you a long time to get there. So you got to do with nearness to what they call in economics power of supply, and of course availability of capital is important. So if you're going into these countries, you must have a strong relationship with a financial institution that can bankroll your idea.
And speak their language, like you said earlier.
Absolutely.
If you're going to Cote d'Ivoire, parlez-vous français.
Like their food.
And like their food, Kelly. Ronak?
So I think the key to doing business in Africa is understanding Africa. And too often we take, Western-centric blueprints and we superimpose it and we expect things that are done in South Africa to work in various countries. But Africa is not a country. There's nuances, there's subtleties, there's complexities, the idiosyncrasies that we need to understand. And we tend to kind of frame things in binaries. And when they don't work out immediately, we blame the environment, we blame all kinds of factors, when the truth is we often don't do our homework. So when I was running my team, I didn't let anyone start before they had read a book called The State of Africa, because context is absolutely important. You need to understand where a country comes from, what its history is, why people behave the way that they do. You need to understand why, generally speaking, Ghanaians are more docile than Nigerians. You know, there's understanding. Jollof rice. You know, these kind of things matter. In the same way that, you know, the regional dynamics between a Kenya and a Tanzania, the behaviors are different, socialist versus capitalist mindsets, that kind of thing. If you don't understand that, you're already on the back foot. So I think critical for me is understanding, appreciating, and understanding that you need to be patient, because there are no quick fixes. It's hard work, but it's hell of a rewarding if you get it right.
State of Africa, who wrote the book?
Martin Meredith.
Martin Meredith, perfect. We'll be sure to find that
one.
one.
It's a good read. It really is. Look, entrepreneurship is tough. The state, most often, unless you're living in Rwanda these days, the state creates significant headwinds. You know, I started a business, I built a business, I sold a business. It's tough. It really is tough. Would I do it again? Sure, but it's not easy. Don't underestimate entrepreneurship. It's a long-term game. I think, however, you know, what needs to be realized, I think, because it's something to step back from a sort of maybe a more theoretical perspective. It's at a micro level, it's incredibly challenging and it's painful at times, but you learn incredible amounts. You really do. As at a macro level, because of these headwinds that the state often creates through action or inaction for aspirant entrepreneurs or successful entrepreneurs, is that it creates at a macro level an incredibly competitive business class. And that we're seeing I think in many cases in this part of the world, where you have this ability of fortitude almost to succeed, not with the tailwinds, but to succeed despite the odds and despite the headwinds and what one has to come up against. Don't underestimate it.
Don't underestimate it. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure speaking to each and every one of you and getting your insight into whether it be fufu or elements shaping the African economic landscape at the moment. Thank you so much for your time, and we certainly hope that Afropolitans go away from the conversation with a lot more. So to Martin Davies of Deloitte Africa, Rona Gabaldis from RMB, and our Afrobiz editor at KFM, Adetunji Omotola. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.